representatives from the Community Aviation Alliance Australia, who are joining all by video conference. I understand the information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear today? I'll go on my order here. I'll start with you, Mr Hicks.
Good morning. My name is John Hicks. I am appearing here as a member of the Community Aviation Alliance of Australia, and my home group is the Gold Coast Lifestyle Association, Stop Flight Path Impacts.
Thank you. Mr Chincotta.
Yes, thank you, Chair and fellow senators. My name is John Chincotta, representing Community Aviation Alliance Australia, and also a member of the Dingley Village Community Association, so representing that group also with a separate submission that's been presented.
Thank you. And Ms Saunders.
Hi, good morning, Chair and fellow senators. My name is Lynn Saunders. I'm a member of the CAAA, as the other two gentlemen. And I'm also representing Flight Path Forum, which is based on the Sunshine Coast, and we also have submitted a separate submission.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much to you all. Now you have the opportunity to make an opening statement if you wish. Best to try and keep it brief if possible so we have time for questions. Did anyone want to make? You can all make one, but as I say, brief the best. But anyone want to make an opening statement?
Yes, I'm going to make an opening statement on behalf of us all.
Thank you.
And we have tabled that, but I will read through it just so that it all gets properly Hansarded and transcripted, and then I obviously will open the floor for questions after that. But thank you, Chair. And thank you all for the opportunity to appear at this important hearing. Community Aviation Alliance Australia, CAAA, is an Australia-wide coalition of community advocacy groups impacted by aircraft noise. Our shared aim is to ensure that the impact of the aviation industry on Australian communities, in particular the detrimental effects of aircraft noise and operations, are better understood, regulated and mitigated. This inquiry is focused on the impact and mitigation of aircraft noise, and the submissions of CAAA and our other individual community groups highlight how important these issues are across these impacted areas across Australia. So firstly, the impact of aircraft noise on ordinary people is real. We want to get across to you as decision makers how debilitating aircraft noise can be for some people in terms of wellbeing, mental health and general amenity. Noise adversely affects people in their day-to-day lives as badly as other pollutants, and evidenced by the number of complaints received from impacted communities. It's not acceptable in today's sustainable society that aircraft noise is unregulated, unlike other industries that have had to adapt to societal expectations. We also want to highlight the specific noise issues impacting communities under the flight paths of general aviation airports, such as Moorabbin, Jandakot, Bankstown, Archerfield and Parafield, caused by highly repetitive circuit training, as distinct from those at the major airports. These movements, which can number between 500 to 1,000 flyovers a day following the same circuit path, warrant separate consideration in your final report, as mitigation measures will differ at these airports. So, just to go through our issues and recommendations, we've got the starting point. Our key issues are Australia's current aviation regulatory and policy framework is not fit for purpose in that it has a complete absence of regulation that effectively protects communities from the harmful health impacts of aircraft noise. It ignores the direct and indirect costs of aircraft noise on human health, community amenity, devaluation of property, noise amelioration works, and allows the noise polluters, the airlines and airports, to externalise these costs to the wider community. It's a complex and fragmented amalgamation of Commonwealth statutes, state and local government land planning legislation across multiple portfolios, heavily weighted towards promoting unfettered growth of the aviation industry. It relies on state-based planning schemes to limit residential development around airports, but it has no effective provisions to protect residents from the noise impacts of growing aircraft traffic at these existing airports or the development at new airports and other locations. It limits the role of the Commonwealth Regulatory Agency, CASA, to only managing aircraft safety and efficiency, with nothing in the civil aviation safety regulations that specifically deals with CASA's regulation, approval, administration of airspace, airways and air routes. This regulatory vacuum fails to protect Australian communities. It features the ANEF, the National Airport Safeguarding Framework, NASF guidelines, which are no longer fit for purpose as they currently stand. It's been over 40 years since the last community study on impacts on aircraft noise was undertaken for the ANEF. As an ineffective community consultation process, CAGs do not resolve community concerns, nor do they have any decision-making powers. The current mechanisms and arrangements fail community needs. Has an ineffective complaint handling system. The current system administered by Air Services Australia is ineffective, as the root cause of the complaints is not addressed and people are left frustrated by the process. Since lodging our CAAA submission, the Australian Government has published its aviation white paper. There are several initiatives that have benefits for aircraft noise and in affected communities. However, there's still disappointing gaps we wish to highlight as still requiring urgent attention in the public interest. These include no policy intent to develop and implement via legislation new aircraft noise standards which can be understood by the community, measured and monitored to mitigate impacts on community health and amenity, even though we have standards and regulation for most other categories of noise and other pollutants such as odour through the EPA that harm citizens. No policy intent or trigger points for mitigation action involving flight caps or nighttime curfews, and a lack of any semblance of, by pushing and expanding the balance and operation of aircraft in Australia with regard to advanced aircraft mobility such as drones. To conclude, we would like to summarise our key recommendations for improved management and mitigation of aircraft noise. Firstly, a new aircraft noise standard which is easily understood by the community, that can be measured, monitored, and it defines trigger points for noise mitigation actions. Options such as revised noise abatement procedures, change flight paths, noise amelioration to existing dwellings, movement caps, curfews. The values in the standard to be based on findings of a comprehensive community health study, which makes explicit the health impacts and direct and indirect costs of aviation. These values to be reflected in the standards for revised ANEF, NASF, EPBC Act and AS 2021. These must not be guidelines but statutory enforceable. Thoroughly review and amend the Airports Act and the Civil Aviation Regulations Act, as noted in our submission. I won't go through the detailed points, but they're clearly in our submission and in this summary statement that's been provided. Number 4, the Aircraft Noise Ombudsman should become part of the Office of the Commonwealth Ombudsman with an appropriate mandate and adequate resourcing, i.e. be truly independent. And finally, to restore balance, ensure the two key regulators, CASA and the department, operate under amended legislation requiring appropriate weight be given in decision-making to the concerns of community groups about the impacts and mitigation of aircraft noise. The current paradigm of aircraft operational efficiency being prioritised over the health and other impacts of aircraft noise must be changed. And finally, a refreshed regulatory approach to general aviation airports, conducting repetitive circuit training activities to include noise mitigation strategies such as sharing of flight paths where alternative runways exist, limiting pilot training activities at night and weekends, limiting movements to not exceed thresholds set in the current NASF guidelines, installation of permanent noise monitors at the primary general aviation airports so that compliance with the NASF and other established aircraft noise standard can be monitored, which then allows Air Services, CASA and the ANO to draw on fact-based evidence when making decisions regarding contraventions by aircraft. And with that, we finish our opening statement. I know there's a lot there and a lot to take in, but appreciate you listening to us and making that opening statement. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chin-Cotter. No, we appreciate the detail and your diligence here in providing that. I've just got a few questions before going to other senators. Since your submission has been provided to us, the government has published a white paper for aviation. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at that or any of the papers to anyone here online. Do you have any comments, especially around the recommendations on noise in that document?
Yes, so we mentioned it in our opening statement. While there are some good things that have come out of that white paper, it does speak to the independence of the ANO and other measures there. It still doesn't specifically address any regulation regarding aircraft noise. It still doesn't put any standard on what's fair and acceptable with regard to what the community experiences in real life. So it's still absolutely silent on that aspect.
I mean, what do you want to see? I noticed in your submission, just on that point, I'll come back to some other parts of the white paper, but in your submission you talk about how the noise contours are somewhat, I think, unreliable or not fit for purpose to measure the actual impact on human beings. I imagine that one of the issues here is it is quite hard to measure exactly the impact on someone on the ground, given all the other environmental factors. Is there a sensible way of proscribing, codifying in law a specific noise standard which might be struggled to be measured properly and enforced in the real world?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chair, and I think it's easier to understand from people who don't live in affected areas when you look at the two current standards. The ANEF contours are very difficult to understand to the common person. They don't rely on real noise levels. The ANSF guidelines are much better because they actually say number of movements above a certain decibel level. So, and they describe the decibel levels. So, no more than 20 movements above 70 dBA, no more than 50 above 65, no more than 100 above 60. So at least those decibel levels are what you hear in real life. So if you're in your backyard...
Where are those measured? What's the point of measurement? Is it inside a home, out in the backyard?
It's outside a home.
Outside,
so
okay.
That's right. And that's, I mean, they're both important measures. Inside the home, I suppose, also, because if you've got protection, you're not protected. But those levels are measured around what are considered noise intrusions, such as somebody mowing their grass or, so it's at those levels that can be easily understood. And then you can understand in terms of aircraft movements, because that's, again, something that's easily understood. But they're just guidelines. So even if an airport exceeds those limits, you can't go to an airport through a CAG or through any operational meeting and enforce anything. So people can complain, but because there's no regulation, CASA Air Services don't have anything to enforce against. So there's no pressure on airports or on operations to even come up with any noise mitigation strategies, because there's nothing that's forcing them to, because they're not bound by those standards, because they're guidelines. So, I mean, if I could give one example with the general aviation airports. So we have, as I mentioned in the opening, at an airport such as Moorabbin, it's 500 to 1,000 flyovers a day. So, and that's repetitive circuit flying in one path. So if somebody lives in a flight path, and where we have had monitors put in place at certain times of the year the measures have been over 150 to 200 movements above 60 dBA, where the NAS guideline is 100. So that's twice the level of threshold. And on a 10-hour working day, that's the equivalent of one flyover above the threshold every 3 to 4 minutes. So when you actually break it down into plain English that you can, the layperson can understand, you look at it and you go, how can that be fair? How can that be reasonable? And then there's no recourse for people who complain that are affected by this in their daily lives to be able to influence and impact any change. Complaining through the Air Services noise complaint system doesn't achieve that, because all they can do is they respond to the complaint. They don't address the root cause or put any pressure back on the airport to change those movements so that the community isn't faced with those exceeding thresholds.
How do those noise thresholds, how are they measured in the real world, if at all, especially given that at least during the day there'll be a lot of other ambient noise? So how does any measurement specifically target or measure the aircraft noise relative to other noise occurring in and around a city?
Yeah. I believe the way the monitors are set up is they're designed so that they can exclude those other surrounding impacts, be it birds, be it, as you said, car travel. So they are sophisticated enough to pick up the spikes that happen when the aircraft come over.
Okay.
So in that regard, they are, reasonably accurate. And failing that, the easiest bit of accuracy, go out, stand under the flight path of an impacted area and listen for yourself and count the movements on an hourly basis, multiply that by 10 or whatever, and then multiply that by 365 days, and you've got a pretty good idea of how impactful it is.
Okay.
John Lynn.
Chair, can I also add to that the noise monitoring at airports is carried out by Air Services. In the case of the Gold Coast Airport, there's 2 permanent monitors, 1 temporary one, and that is a program that does not do justice to the air traffic currently at the airport, let alone its projected increase in the future. There's no program that, based on that noise monitoring, generates checks on these noise contours that we see in airport master plans, for example. So the capacity of Air Services to monitor is limited by resources, and the legitimate expectation of the community that they can have confidence that those contours that are in master plans are accurate. There's no mechanism in place to actually check on those. It is possible. The ANEF is not a measurable concept, it's a formulaic concept, but N contours, for example, are measurable, and that should be done, and that's a gap, an important gap. And I've got a worked example here about the problems that travel with the expanding noise event contours at airports that I could go into. I've provided a diagram.
Maybe we might come back. I'm interested in it. I'm just mindful of other senators, so I've used enough time, and I want one more question, then I'm going to go to other senators, and if we have time, I'll be interested in your example. Just finally from me, I noticed in the white paper there's going to be a proposed requirement that master plans, development plans prioritise decarbonisation. Do you think that the goal of reducing carbon emissions should be prioritised over or at the same level as reducing noise?
I think it's a very situational approach. But noise does harm. We know this from the studies that have been peer reviewed in by WHO and other organisations. I think that we need a flexible situational approach where if aircraft have to fly additional track miles to deliver a significant noise reduction, that's the acceptable trade-off. However, in the current regime, that's the least preferred option. And we hope that that gets better as aircraft transfer to sustainable aviation fuel. But in the current context, additional track miles to get a better noise outcome for affected communities is a fair outcome in my view.
So, I mean,
Chair,
Yep. Sorry, Ms Saunders.
Sorry, just to add to Mr Hicks' comments. Certainly carbon emissions are deemed to be important, reduction of those carbon emissions. And although it's not something that we under the CAAA have been focused on or studying, our focus has mostly been on the noise reduction and possible recommendations that can be made to achieve that. In the Sunshine Coast, we went forward and hired a flight path designer, one that's actually approved by both CASA and Air Services Australia, to come up with a range of additional proposed flight paths. Now, those flight paths, and our submission is available, I know. I won't go into great detail, but those flight paths actually provide for a shared responsibility in the aircraft movement across a range of communities, not just concentrated in the current areas, as well as those flight paths reducing the flight time, reducing flight fuel usage, and thereby reducing carbon emissions. And that's something that we haven't had any feedback from Air Services Australia to date. But it is something that our communities certainly take into consideration and think would be valuable to the Australian community and the aviation industry.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Senator Sterle.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'll come to you, Mr Cincotta, and I'll go to your second recommendation, and you have touched on this. You say reducing flight operation times, particularly on weekends and evenings when most people are predominantly home and carrying out outdoor activities. And from someone who lives over a flight path, mine's GA and helicopters from Jandakot, I couldn't imagine 500 or 1,000. I'll just lay that on the table because we don't have that. What actually would appease the community? Is it pack up Moorabbin so it doesn't operate on weekends, or is it curfews, or is it move it out to somewhere else? What's the actual request?
Yeah, so Jandakot, one of our CAAA members was from Jandakot, so he's since moved. So that tends to happen with people who join our community groups, and when they get nowhere in terms of any action, they actually move. So I understand and appreciate the flyovers at Jandakot. To go back to Moorabbin, Moorabbin on movements is the biggest or second biggest busiest airport in Australia behind Tullamarine, and it's not well understood. And this is, it's a general aviation airport like Jandakot, and those movements, 500 to 1,000 a day, are real, and that includes that. And those numbers don't include the helicopter traffic that also operates at the airport as well. So what do we want? I mean, ideally, these, and look, and this is separate to the major airports, these general aviation airports that conduct flight training should be relocated to areas that aren't under residential development. When they were first built, there wasn't that much residential development around the area. In Moorabbin, it was a lot of largely green wedge. But that's not the case now. It's fully populated, fully residential. So the recommendation to solve it is to relocate. understanding that's difficult. You've got flight operators that have invested money in the airport and so forth. So notwithstanding moving something, if that's not possible, we want to be practical about this. There are other strategies of mitigation that can happen, and there's more flexibility at a general aviation airport as compared to the major airports. But yeah, there can be flight sharing. There can be reduced time where they can condense the training during the days when people are at work, and maybe having it more open and less activity on the weekends and evenings. So there's the possibility for increased strategies to have that flexibility if relocation is not an option.
Yeah, still very wide open response. I appreciate that. But I do touch on, so the community understands, and I did do some Googling. This is the problem when airports are built and then people, then we have urbanisation around them. I know that happens all over Australia. We can't get away from that. But would the community, I'll just narrow it down, would the community accept reduced hours as a fix?
Yes,
They would, okay, all right. I wasn't quite
Yeah.
sure because it was sort of, you'd love to move it out, I got that, but you did say that you have to be, you got to work together, you did say that. So, and it's particularly the weekend, and you said in your statement to us that, it's 10 o'clock at night, they're still flying, still doing, and is that training?
Yeah, that's training. So the airport operates the day training, but then every evening there's night training. So the hours are during daylight savings hours. They go until 10 p.m. The rest of the year it's till 9 p.m. So again, when there's the circuit is full, there's 7 aircraft in the circuit. It's basically a plane flying overhead every 2 to 3 minutes.
Wow.
I know for people not in affected areas, it sounds that can't be right, but it is. It's a plane every 2 to 3 minutes. As one passes, there's a period of respite, and then you hear the next plane approaching. And then there's a crescendo when that plane passes, and then it just continues on. So one after the other, continuously, from 8:30 a.m. each morning till 10 p.m. during daylight savings hours every day. 365 days a year, only not affected by weather movements if there's particularly windy days.
Yes, you'd look forward to them windy days. And is that just recently or been going on for decades?
No, that's been in place. Yeah, I mean we do have a fly friendly where on weekends they need to stop operating by 6 p.m. on Saturdays and Sundays.
You have that now?
Yeah, that fly friendly has been in place a little while, and that just goes to show that there can be flexibility to limit those movements, to reduce the times.
So that's
with the airport.
Sorry, that's training. I wasn't aware that. So you've got that. They've come to that agreement just recently, or whatever. That's been negotiated between the airport and the communities.
Yes, a fly friendly was set up when before I moved into the area. So at least it's been effective at least in the last 15 years.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right,
and that cap and even the nighttime caps. That's not the planes that fly in and out for commercial reasons. They can still do that at any time. So it's 24-hour airport. But the complaints aren't to do with those airports and that aircraft. It's the flight training and the repetitive nature of the circuit training, one after the other, 7 to 8, maxing out a circuit. It's that repetitive training that causes the issues.
Okay.
Thank you, Cindy.
Okay, and is that the same for the other 2 airports?
Yes.
Yes, but not to the same level, Senator, as the Gold Coast. And in the 2024 master plan for the Gold Coast Airport, it foreshadows tapering down the general aviation operations at that airport and increasing the RPT traffic at that airport.
Okay.
And for us on the Sunshine Coast, they've removed for GA aircraft the visual flight path that they used to have to follow, which kept them on a certain track. So now the general aviation can fly all over the place and constantly are sightseeing up and down the coast and over homes where they never used to fly previously.
And Ms. Saunders,
and that was just a recent decision with the new air runway.
Okay. And my last one, Chair, Ms. Saunders, that you did say when you talked about reducing emissions and saving fuel and that virtually, for want of a better word, sharing the love or sharing the pain around other parts of the Sunshine Coast?
Yes.
Yeah, and
yes.
And has that been put out publicly, that thought from your community to other communities?
We have publicised it. Absolutely. It's publicly available.
Yeah, and how was the feedback from other communities? It's not to set you up. Well, no one wants it, I understand. But
oh, sure. Oh, you mean other... Well, Flight Path Forum is an amalgamation of 10 different communities in the area. Certainly, the communities that would then be newly flown over, of course, they don't want it.
Yeah, cool.
There are less dense population groups out that way, not to mitigate the fact that they would be newly overflown as we are now. We didn't previously have any aircraft in our area until they created this new runway a couple of years ago. Right. So most people, most communities, they know that they can be affected at any time. We do a lot of community consultation and engagement ourselves, and they do understand that as we have been, our various communities here have been affected newly. They could also, as the airport expands, which we expect will happen. And so they are prepared to come to the table with that, let's share the load. Let's not have it dominate particular specific communities.
Yep, I understand. Look, thanks very much for that. It's a tough one, isn't it? Thanks, Chair.
It is, very.
Thank you, Senator Colbeck. Senator Hodgins-May.
Yeah, thank you for your time this morning. Have AAA met with Minister King to discuss these queries? Have you met with Minister King?
I've got a little bit of information on that, Senator. That none of us here have, but I'm advised by other members that there was a request for a ministerial meeting with Minister King in June 2022. A reply was received, and members subsequently met with the Senior Advisor for Transport in the Minister's office and opened a dialogue there, which continued with correspondence in the lead up to the Green Paper, which our members found quite useful. In recent times, over the last 8 months or so, there hasn't been that ongoing contact. So short answer, no meeting directly with the Minister, just the policy advisor, senior advisor.
Thank you. And that's for CAAA and also the respective groups that you represent in another capacity. Is that correct for both? Do you know?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for that. Now, in your submission, you state that the majority of your members report that the department's community aviation consultation groups for federally leased airports need fundamental reform to be effective and have any credibility with affected communities. Could you give me a little bit more information about why you think they haven't been effective in engaging and elevating community voices? Please.
I can start off, Senator. At Gold Coast Airport, we changed the operating model to introduce a strategic work program hitting the issues of significance that should be resolved. And we've had some progress in but not a lot of effective traction through that means. But the key thing is that departmental officers post-COVID tend to attend meetings via video link, and that's a very unsatisfactory way of doing business and forming any sort of ongoing dialogue and relationship with clients. So we'd like to see the CAG guidelines are up for renewal. We'd like to see it insisted that senior officers do attend in person to hear the concerns of community and form an ongoing dialogue through that mechanism.
I can add to that in terms of my experience with the Moorabbin Airport CAG. I'm a member of that. We've got a really good relationship with the CAG and the members there and the airport. But the CAG itself is very much just an information sharing exercise where the airport tells us about, and the other stakeholders there about what's happening in terms of development, aviation increasing, and so when noise is brought up as an issue and the community concerns, it gets shut down because effectively anything that will impact the operations of the airport are not listened to. And again, it gets back to there's no regulatory pressure or anything that that warrants them taking any action. So it's very difficult as a community representative to actually achieve anything because they just don't want to talk about anything that relates to the noise complaints that are coming from the community. Air services and CARSA attend, but largely just to be present, to be able to tick the box that they've attended. Air services recently have provided reports on the complaint monitoring, which has been useful to understand the numbers and get that detail. But again, it's just reporting, there's been a lot of complaints and they're complaining about circuit training, which we all know and which we've been reporting for the last 10 to 15 years. But then that doesn't lead to, okay, so that's the issue. How can we deal with it? How can we make it better for the community? So there's no follow-on to actually any mitigation because the airport's not bound to do that.
So in your view...
And that's the same... Sorry, Senator, that's the same...
Sorry, just to finish off on John's point, Senator, that's the key thing. There's no trigger in legislation that requires action to be taken when a point has been exceeded that's considered to be unacceptable aircraft noise, and that needs to be nailed down. And I think the witnesses following us, the noise experts, will be the ones most useful in that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lynn.
Yeah, sorry, Lynn,
no,
just
that's
before
okay,
you go
John.
in, I just wanted to say,
Yep.
and with those other stakeholders who are there, because I know you're speaking to them later, CARSA and their services, when it comes to the community putting up, the issues regarding the noise, they are completely silent. They do not want to enter that space or get into those discussions. They're not siding with the community at all. They're very much there, to minimise anything that will impact what they need to do. And that's really frustrating from a community membership point of view. You really felt, again, to the ineffectiveness of CAGs, you're one community member amongst a group of other stakeholders that have got no motivation to change the status quo.
Thank you very much. You answered my supplementary question in those further responses. Just one last question, if I may, to John Hicks.
I cut Lynn off though. Did you want to add something, Lynn?
Oh, yeah, Lynn,
That's
sorry.
okay. No, I just... thank you, Senator. I just wanted to reinforce that that's exactly the same experience that we also have with the ineffectiveness of CAG. It's lip service, it's very superficial, and if any real issues are raised, they get ignored, shut down.
Thank you.
And Senator, sorry, just on that, in our submission, the CAAA one, At the end of it, there's from all of our community groups, we've given some examples of feedback on how we've experienced CAGs. So there's further information there for you to draw on as well.
Terrific, thank you. I will do that. Just one final question to Mr Hicks, and specifically relating to Gold Coast Lifestyle Association's submission, if I may. In your submission, you mentioned legacy provisions that allow 4 air freighter movements per week during curfew hours. You explain in your submission that these are a relic from a time when they were required to facilitate the delivery of weekend newspapers printed in Sydney to the Gold Coast, a need that hasn't existed for, I think, 20 years. Have you met with and or written to the Minister about those legacy provisions and received any reply?
Yes, we have, Senator, and this issue was highlighted during COVID when Qantas sought to use those provisions for freight, and in the context of reduced air traffic during COVID and the importance of the freight, nobody had a problem with that really. However, Qantas then sought a long-term permission to operate within curfew for normal freight delivery operations. Our organisation and others banded together to oppose that, and we certainly did speak with the Minister, Barnaby Joyce at the time, and in the end the Minister refused permission for that application for long-term operation during curfew hours, which we were appreciative of, and that's why we wanted to get rid of the legacy enabling provisions in the regulation. But when we followed that up with the Minister more recently, the position is still no change. Those legacy issues stay.
Thank you. And they haven't provided any reason for the continuation of those?
Look, I don't have, no, they haven't. I think, again, if there was a need caused by supply chain issues for critical goods and stuff like this, and that was explained to the community, there'd be no problem with that, But I think the Minister would have the power to very quickly make a regulation that enabled that, But here we've got a regulation sitting on the books just waiting to be used by the next opportunist who might come along.
Do you feel that the curfew is under threat as a consequence?
We've got no strong signal about that at present, and I would stress that it is an absolutely vital element of noise mitigation at Gold Coast Airport, and we are very lucky to have it. And I would certainly recommend that the department look at imposing a curfew provisions at airports that don't have them at the moment, that have the potential to grow, the future ones, for example, Ballina, and just make it clear to head off a lot of these problems that we're experiencing. It would be good to get in early and prevent some of these problems, and a curfew is a very good mechanism. Everyone deserves a good night's sleep.
Thank you so much. That's all from me.
Yeah, and to reinforce that, I mean the flight friendly that we've got with the 6 p.m. on the weekends, those the curfews, if nothing else, they do provide something significant to communities. So it absolutely is a measure that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hodgins-May. Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to go back to one of the questions that you answered from Senator Hodgins-May in relation to the way the CAGs operate. And on a couple of occasions have said any real issues, if I can put it in those terms, they get shut down. How does that manifest? Is it that's not something that we deal with in this forum, or is it? How does that process manifest?
I can speak. I mean, in my experience is that when it's brought up in terms of say that, it's the chair of the CAG will come back and say, we've addressed noise, there's nothing we can do with that. The operations of the airport are not going to change. We're here to run an airport. And so there's, it's shut down in that way. It's just, it doesn't lead to a follow-on of outside discussions to work through, potential mitigation strategies.
So effectively it's a limitation of the conversations that can be had within that CAG structure. Correct,
yeah, because there's no regulation, it's nothing that forces the airport to make those changes when it impacts their operations. So between the chair of the CAG, the CEO of the airport, they make no allusions to the fact that they're there to run an airport and run it to be commercially viable, which is disappointing from the community point of view.
So effectively it's a reporting process, not a responding process.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. It's information sharing process. Of my experience of the CAG, it's information sharing about what the airport is doing and less about dealing with issues that may come up.
So, Senator, on the Gold Coast, our experience is a little different. Our chair, Ron Brent, was the former aircraft noise ombudsman. He's a very good chair of our committee. I think we get a fair hearing. I think we've had to encourage engagement with the airport a fair bit during that process, but we do seem to be able to clearly articulate what our strategic issues are, get them on the agenda, have a reasonable conversation with the airport representatives about that, or air services. It's just that then the critical follow-up hits the barrier of it's not enabled by legislation, for example, no noise trigger in legislation, or the ability to follow up with the ministerial office is we've got no power as a community group in the relationship with the ministerial office, whereas the airports and the airlines seem to have ready access. There's an imbalance in access to have an ongoing conversation about what would be appropriate in the community interest. But, in terms of expanding noise zones at airports, coming into areas of existing dwellings on the Gold Coast, rapidly densifying city around a growing airport, the legislation doesn't trigger any requirement for noise amelioration or additional noise abatement procedures and so on. And so that's, I suppose, part of the frustration. We can only take our concerns so far before we fall into a regulatory gap.
Okay. Just going back to the point that you made with respect to growing airport and expanding residential communities. And I think we go to the point that was made earlier with respect to Moorabbin, which once upon a time would have been out in the boondocks, so to speak, but now is very much urbanised. What about the application of planning overlays to protect the asset of an airport? I mean, it's a different conversation, I know, but the encroachment of residential property onto airports and their operations is, it's the other side of the coin that we're talking about. How do you see that?
Yeah, well, I can speak specifically about that in terms of Moorabbin because they've just approved the development of Kingswood Golf Club, Kingswood Golf Course, which is directly under the circuit training flight paths. So, again, you've got a new community that's going to be built there. potentially up to 800 new homes built directly under the flight path of the circuit training, where the numbers are going to exceed the NASF guidelines. So those thresholds are absolutely exceeded in terms of where that new development is going to be built. And that was put up as one of the reasons opposing that development, yet that's been approved. So it had no impact on that new development.
Okay.
And in relation to the Gold Coast, the ANEF planning framework applies, and as the city densifies, those new apartment towers, for example, that fall within the ANEF 20 must be built to a higher code with more noise insulation. However, if we just look at the expanding ANEF and the expanding N70 contours, for example, the N70 contour expands to about 4.5 times its current length when the airport reaches ultimate practical capacity. And there are many existing dwellings subject to 200 noise events a day at 70 dBA as a result of that expansion in the future. And they have no protection currently in legislation from, from noise, and they need to be afforded that. And we note that the Melbourne Airport third runway came with a condition for noise amelioration to surrounding dwellings, and we think that should be the standard for all of Australia. Western Sydney has a provision for noise amelioration that's very clear, and its target indoor noise level is 50 decibels. And again, that helps existing residents in the expanding noise footprints of growing airports. But currently at the moment, no policy, no regulation that would require that. And we think it's reasonable to do that for an airport as a normal cost of expanding its business in return for increasing aircraft flights. And obviously this is what's happened with Melbourne and its third runway.
I just want to go sort of on from there a little bit in respect of all of your submissions, which make a number of recommendations of changes to various existing regulatory frameworks. Have you had a look more broadly in other jurisdictions as to what you see might be a best or better practice model?
Personally, no.
You're all looking very locally at your own issues, and I get that, I understand that. But you also have a broader national network that you're looking at.
Yes.
And in terms of your own local issues, whether it be GA training or the expansion of services on the Gold Coast or on the sunny coast, they're all very well, but if we're looking at a systematic way of improving the circumstance for everybody, have you had a look at anything that might be best or better practice that could be applied on a standard approach that would make those differences across the board? So we're not having piecemeal ways of dealing with things.
Yeah, it's a really good question. If it is being better done somewhere else in the world, then those practices hopefully could be adopted here. But personally, no, I'm not part of any international group. One of our committee members is and does provide some information. We would hope that as part of this inquiry, when you drill down into trying to come up with some recommendations, perhaps you could look at internationally if there are airports around the world that are better managed and take the community more into account. I know they're the WHO guidelines that are a bit more stringent. Are they being actively applied at any other major airports around the world? I'm not sure personally.
We have had. Thanks, Senator. We have taken a look, and this was a couple of years ago, at what was being done in Amsterdam. They, as you know, have an airport right in the city centre. Building code and building standards came into play, and a lot of those building standards that would ameliorate noise impact to residents inside their homes, they differ to Australian building construction and building codes. So there wasn't a like for like in a lot of ways. I think, as John said, we're looking as a somewhat newly formed national body. We're pulling in as much information as we can from other Australian communities as to what they've been able to achieve locally, working with their own airport and airport management in order to mitigate noise and impact on the community. And we would like to see certainly a overarching body come up with some standards that can be applied, and be it amelioration practices whereby there's a levy put onto every seat sold on aircraft throughout the country that goes into a reserve fund to help to finance amelioration of impacted homes across various communities. That's certainly something that we think could be of high value to help current residents that are impacted as airports grow. And we know that airports will continue to grow. It's a big business opportunity for this country, and we need to find a way where the communities can be really have a seat at the table and be a stakeholder in the plans going forward and how their interests are going to be protected.
Looking at time. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Colbeck. Look, we are out of time, so I was interested, Mr Hicks, in your worked example, but I better move on. If you would like to provide that to us, or if there's a way to provide it in written form, feel free to do that. Don't think any other questions on notice were taken, but we're asking for that additional information, any other information back by the 27th of September to help us finalise our report. Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Very much appreciated. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
No problem.